Hello and welcome to my podcast. My name is Kelly Green, and this is Confessions of a Gen X Activist, True Crime Stories. Today's episode, we're leveling up, going to college and getting our first career in audiovisual communications. But first, I need to back up a little bit. I left off in Clayoquot Sound, where I was arrested along with nearly 900 other people in what became the largest single mass arrest in Canadian history, only to be surpassed by another mass arrest in the Canadian forest a few summers ago out in Fairy Creek. So that was quite an exciting summer. I'm 22 years old. I spent the time out there getting arrested and made my way back just in time for school in the fall of 1993. I had to go to court again in October for the first court appearance. Put together a little fundraiser at the Eco City Society multi-purpose rumpus room, hired some musical acts, and bought some booze and got some food together and raised some money in order to get down to Victoria for that first court appearance, which I guess was in October of 2003. Upon getting out to Victoria, I was informed by my lawyer, who neglected to call me the Friday, I guess, that our court dates had been moved now until the summer of 1994, which would turn out to be quite fortuitous. So back I went to Grant MacEwan Community College. I'm in my first year of audiovisual communications, and what I'm trying to do with my communications work and my communication studies is to combine my activist interest in the issues of the day and the solutions to address those issues, and combine those into the various projects that I was working on in audio production, photography, graphic arts, video production, this type of thing. Now, in the first year, I was fairly new, so there wasn't a lot of groundbreaking stuff, but I think in that first year, I did collaborate with newly elected city councillor. I believe they were referred to as alderman before he was elected, and he refused to take the more sexist alderman title, instead adopting councillor or alderperson. Maybe he first adopted at the time, Tucker Gomberg. He was a councillor here in Edmonton, I believe, between 1992 and 1995. So I'd collaborated with him on a project that he was trying to get introduced and pushed through City Council, which was a Rails to Trails network connecting the south side and the north side on disused rail lines. More specifically, and I guess the glamorous part of that project was turning the upper deck of the high-level bridge, where there's the old railroad tracks up there and a streetcar crosses during the summer, turning that old upper deck into a giant multi-purpose trail, which would connect from Strathcona all the way up through downtown, through to the new Grant MacEwan Community College campus, and then further up through into the northwest part of Edmonton eventually. So that was pretty exciting, working on those projects. Now, nothing came of that Rails to Trails project immediately, but it is something that is still being bandied about, and it's not an unusual project to have taken place in the last 30 years across many North American cities, turning old disused rail networks into path networks for pedestrians and cyclists, and now scooters and I guess skateboarders, and essentially an alternative transportation to the internal combustion engine. So in 1994, I finished my first year of college, and it was time to head out for court and for trial on Vancouver Island. I was booked for the summer, so I thought, well, I might as well just head out there for the entire summer. A good friend of mine who I'd mentioned in previous episodes, and Max, you'll remember Brent Thoma, he'd sourced me I think it was a 1981 blue two-door Honda Civic hatchback. It was a real beater for the time, although it wasn't that old, maybe, I don't know, 13 years old at the time. So I bought that car for a few $100s and drove on out to Victoria, where I applied for social assistance, found an apartment to rent, which was happily the same building that a co-defendant in our case of criminal trespass in blocking the logging road for Clayoquot Sound. One of my co-accused was living in the apartment, as it turned out, right underneath the one that I had just rented. And the reason for renting an apartment was to prepare for house arrest, as we'd found out that many, if not all, of the people being convicted from Clayoquot Summer, the War in the Woods, were getting house arrest. Now, granted, people early on in the process were getting actual jail time, but those spaces were filling up quite quickly because, as I mentioned, there was nearly 900 people arrested that summer. So I had an apartment all ready to go for house arrest. I'm still hanging around with folks down at the hostel, because I didn't have any other friends really except for that other gentleman I was arrested with. So a lot of my peer group, fellow travelers, were down at the hostel, and that was where I met my first wife, Eva Maria. She had come to the hostel one afternoon all sunburnt from cycling in the hot sun. We'd immediately struck up a conversation and started hanging out shortly thereafter and blossomed into a relationship quite quickly. She wasn't in town very long before she had to head back to San Francisco, where she was flying back to Europe in a couple of weeks. And as it turned out, I'd gone through the trial. I was found guilty of criminal trespass, as everyone else was, and the judge set another date for sentencing. So while I was awaiting sentencing, I thought, well, I'm still free. I will, maybe like to head down to California. I didn't have any money, didn't have any work at the time. Like I said, I was just collecting social insurance, but for odd expenses money and for fun during the summer, I would cart tourists around. Like I said, I had that Honda Civic, and I put up a little notice in the hostel that should anybody like a personal driver to tour around Vancouver Island while on vacation, I would gladly do that for the cost of gas and food. And a few people took me up on that idea. One gentleman, a photographer from Australia, we traveled together all the way up the island to Port Hardy, which was quite nice, Alert Bay. Did some eagle watching. It's quite amazing. And then when I wanted to go to California, I put up a notice, and it turns out another Australian who had come up to the coast of North America, he had a surfboard with him. He wanted to head down to San Francisco and check out the waves down there. So he was happy to pay for gas and food. Drove down there in one shot, I think about 15, 16 hours to get down to San Francisco. Spent a few days there visiting and hanging out with Eva Maria before she had to fly back to Europe. And then I put up another notice in the Green Tortoise Hostel in San Francisco, should anybody need to or want to get up to Canada, Vancouver, Victoria way, that I had a car, and for the cost of gas and food, I'd be happy to take them up that way. So I ended up putting together a good group of folks. There were 6 of us all together, 3 that traveled with me in my Honda Civic, and then all of our luggage traveled with another young couple from South Africa in their rental car. And we traveled together up the west coast and really took our time. We camped on the beach. We went to the old growth. We went to the, not the old growth, well, they are old growth, very old growth, the redwood forest. So some of these trees are 2,000 years old. These are the giant trees that you'll see in pictures and on TV and in the movies. Amazing trees. Anyways, we took our time traveling up the coast and made it back to Victoria in time to find out that in my sentencing, I wasn't given house arrest after all. I was given 1 year probation, a $500 fine, and 50 community hours. So I thought, wow, that's excellent. That's such fantastic news. Now, there's still a month left in the summer. I still had my apartment. I thought I'd be sitting in there for 2-3 weeks under house arrest, but that wasn't the case. And still hanging out at the hostel, I noticed that somebody put up a note on the board advertising a one-way ticket to Frankfurt for $300. I thought, wow, that's excellent. Frankfurt can't be far from Switzerland, where my new found love, Eva Maria, had just returned to her home. Maybe I'll go to Europe and surprise her. So I put a note on the board advertising my Honda Civic for sale for $300. That sold immediately. I bought the airline ticket, and within days I was landing in Frankfurt. I had no return ticket. I had no plan on how I was getting home yet. But, being an impulsive young person at the time and in love, I thought it a very good idea to travel out to Europe, someplace I'd always wanted to go anyways, and spend some time with Eva Maria. That was fantastic. We spent the month out there. I was able to borrow money from my dad to fly back and cover him on my next installment of student loans coming in September. Eva Maria came out to visit at Christmas time, where we're getting along so well that it seemed a good idea to propose. She said yes, and by the following summer, We were married. I'd gone out and spent the entire summer. So this would be summer of 1995. Spent the entire summer in Switzerland. Got married with Eva Maria, and continued on with some of the activism, which was very close to my heart and the work that I wanted to do. I connected with a Greenpeace organization out there. They had just recently blockaded an old limestone mine in Switzerland, and the reason why they were blockading that old mine is the owners of the property wanted to use it as a toxic waste disposal site. So they're going to fill up all these mine caverns with toxic waste, I guess, and then seal it up and call it done and count their money. Now the problem with this is it was a limestone mountain, very porous. So eventually, over time, water is going to get onto this waste. It's going to percolate through, leach through, get into the water supply, get out into the environment, and be a hazard for people and animals and fish and everything else. So Greenpeace blocked that down. I'd caught wind of that, went out and joined the blockade, and was staying out there full time. We had two entrances to the mine, with the road coming in and the mine entrance farther up on the mountain. We had those very, very, very well blocked off. I think I've shown you some of those pictures, and some of my friends who might be listening or watching this have seen some of those pictures as well. When it came time for the media to show up, they were coming along with one of the political delegations. And I had mentioned to the campaigner that I had a ton of excellent photographs that I'd been taking the time that I'd been at the camp. The campaigner thought that would be great to show the politician and the media these photographs, which at the time digital cameras weren't really a thing. So I had to burn back to the city, connect with a photo lab that I'd been doing some summer student work with. They let me use their enlarger in their dark room to print off a bunch of black and white photos of the work that I'd been covering for the last couple of weeks. I jump on a train, head back out to this small town where the mine was. I can't remember the name of the town. And arrived in time for the media, before the media arrived and before the politicians had arrived. So I give these photographs to the campaigner, and he liked them so much. He said, "Wow, these are really great." I said, "Well, thank you. I am actually, in fact, a trained photographer and videographer." And he said, "Well, that's fantastic. We'd like to hire you. We'd like to pay you to be our official photographer." So I was beyond ecstatic. Here they are offering me $300 a day, Swiss francs a day, which was even more than Canadian money, 300 francs a day to be their on-site photographer. And I stayed there for a good 11 to 13 days, I think. I don't remember how long I stayed. Fantastic time staying with those folks. And I think at the end of the day, I'd have to double check, but I think it was a success in the end, where the organization and the local people were able to convince the company and the local government that having this toxic waste site inside an old abandoned limestone mine just outside their town and in their neighborhood, in their region, was not a good idea. So it was a successful campaign. Also in Europe, I'd come across, for the first time, Greenpeace campaigning against genetically modified organisms, GMOs. So this is early, mid-1990s, and it hadn't really become an issue yet in North America. But the Europeans certainly were on the ball. They were far ahead of what environmentalism and campaigning was happening in North America. They were already starting to campaign against GMOs. I think initially the genetically modified organisms, the first of those were GMO corn. So GMOs, essentially, it's not natural selection, it's not breeding, it's not cross-pollinating, it's not anything natural. It's adjusting the DNA at the DNA level, taking out genes or inserting genes. And I think in regards to the corn, there was a gene inserted to make it immune to pesticides. So you could now treat the crop with pesticides. It wouldn't, with a particular pesticide, it wouldn't hurt the corn, and it would kill everything else. Now, unfortunately, these chemicals ended up being incorporated at the genetic level into these plants, and we're still seeing the fallout of health problems that may be associated with genetically engineered food that we've been ingesting for near on 3 decades. Which is why it's a good idea to stay away from GMO food, and a great idea to always try and source organic food, which should be free from all GMOs. It's almost impossible to avoid. GMOs, they went after the largest crops in the world: corn, soy, canola, rice, wheat. Now they're into animals, fish, fruit, strawberries, apples. The list kind of goes on and on and on. Again, Europe was very good at putting controls on these genetically modified organisms. In Canada, not so much. In the United States, not so much. We're sort of the world's guinea pigs on GMOs, and that may be associated with a rising instance of chronic disease and poor health outcomes for North Americans over the last 30 years. But I digress and get on a little bit of a tangent, which I will sometimes, and that's been some of the criticism that a good friend of mine offered me after watching the first and second episode maybe of this podcast. He also mentioned maybe put on a better shirt, try and reduce the ums. I think I've cut that out mostly. The point is, I very much appreciate that people have listened to this podcast outside the target audience of one, and I very much appreciate the criticisms and the points. I'm not going to get all my details correct, so people have offered details that I may have missed. And as in the case of Brent, offering a lot of friendly, constructive criticisms in an attempt to make it better, to improve this podcast. It should also be stated, although I hope that it's obvious and doesn't really need to be, but I'm going to say it anyways. These podcasts, these are personal reflections. These are my own memories of events that I participated in, putting in context with world events. There's a good chance that I might be getting some of the facts wrong, some of the places and the dates and the names wrong, mixing some things up. These things aren't done intentionally. I'm trying to do the best job in recollecting these things truthfully and offering you the best of facts, but it's not always going to be there. You all have tools to the internet. You can fact check and look stuff up if you need to for stuff that I may have gotten wrong. That being said, I want to get back into the show where I'm talking about my activism, larger scale activism, what's happening in the world, and in this episode particularly, how I'm leveling up. So it occurred to me as an activist, as a canvasser, that this was good. I was able to make a living as an activist. The money that we were raising going door to door, this was going into the larger organization to help with their larger efforts at raising awareness and solving the issues, doing the research, and of course funding a lot of the big glamorous actions, whether it be the boats sailing in front of ships trying to stop them from dumping waste, or trying to stop them from whaling or sealing. It was also raising awareness on the micro level. But it occurred to me that one by one, this was a very, very slow way to communicate. So now we have, it's 2024, communicating to a mass audience isn't the problem anymore. What the problem is now is being able to capture those ears and those minds and those hearts out there, because there's so much content to sift through. And then once you do find it, is it real? Is it truthful? Is it fake even? Was put together by a computer through AI? We don't know all these things. But my motivation at the time, as an activist, I wanted to train in the media arts, and through that, if I could then amplify the voices through video, through audio, through photography, and thereby the idea is that if everybody could realize and understand the issues that are facing us, there would be a collective effort to then compel governments and industries and the people that make the decisions in our world to get it together and do what's necessary to alleviate these problems. So that would be, stopping the deforestation, preventing hundreds of animals and plants and insects from going extinct every day, reducing the amount of pollution that's going into the atmosphere and the water and the food that we eat. All of these things would be alleviated if everybody knew what the problem was and we would all come to a consensus on what some of those solutions would be. So the idea was sound, but it wasn't quite getting executed that well. But I was doing my part through school. I was using my projects, like I said, to amplify some of the issues of the day. One of the issues that we worked on, we put together a multimedia show. My friend Matthew Helder, another gentleman, and myself. It was called Hemp for Future. So we had live displays, we had we had a video that we produced, and we interviewed Professor Emeritus of Soil Sciences from the University of Alberta, Dr. Toogood. We interviewed, I can't remember his name. He was the owner, proprietor of True North Hemp Company. They were the early hemp company in the early 1990s, and they had a space not far from Earth's General Store on 108th, 109th Street on White Avenue. So we interviewed him, we interviewed the scientists, we brought together a lot of other information, and we essentially showed to our classmates and our teachers and the people of Grant MacEwan College that hemp could produce more than 50,000 products, from food to paint to explosives to fuel, textiles, plastics, building materials, you name it. It could be made with hemp. I'm not kidding. At the time, hemp was still illegal. It had been an illegal crop for decades following the Second World War because it was associated with cannabis, and it's in the same family, but you could smoke all the hemp you want. You're not going to get high. Obviously, there's no active ingredients of THC. Regardless of that, governments decided we wouldn't promote hemp following World War II. Instead, we would go to much more chemical-intensive crops, which could be controlled a lot easier, and I assume a lot more money could be made. So back in the mid-1990s, as we're working on this Hemp for the Future project, we discovered that you could grow hemp, but you needed a special license from Health Canada to do so under an experimental situation. The regulations have since relaxed, and now we have commercial hemp farmers producing both fiber and seed, the seed for food and for oil, and for various purposes, probably the seed oils used in the paint, and of course the fiber used in a variety of processes, textiles, papers. It can be found, at the time we learned, and it's been since amplified, that an acre of hemp produces more fiber than 4 acres of trees. And it's renewable. It's a crop that we can grow every single year. So there's a lot of things that we can do, a lot of solutions that we can deploy. And by using this, by using my school and the projects that we had to complete, these are obligations that I needed to do, obviously, to graduate from college. Combining those with these issues of the day, able to then amplify these voices through the school, through the teachers, and then outwards into the community. A little bit slower at the time. The internet was just coming into existence, 93, 94, when that started. So we couldn't even put video on the internet. I think it took what seemed like minutes just to even get a connection with a modem to the internet, let alone for it to load a picture. It'd be like loading. It was very painful back in the early days. So we're leveling up. By the spring of 1996, I'm graduating. I took an extra year of college in the second year. I should have graduated in 95, but I was running into some personal issues. My mental health wasn't that great. My dad's wife at the time, she'd recently passed away. That had a bad effect on my mental health. And things were just happening that my school career was looking in jeopardy. The administrators were nice enough to let me cut the second year in half and extend it into a third year, which really helped loosen the workload and enabled me to continue on with my studies through 1996, where I was able to graduate with my diploma from Grant MacEwan Community College, an institution which eventually became Grant MacEwan University, located in Edmonton, its main branch at 104th Ave between 105th and 109th Street. Max, I'm sure you know it, and most everybody knows it here in the city. So I've leveled up. It's 1996, and my final project for school was a documentary that I worked on with a woman, Barb Allard, outside of school. We knew each other from our Greenpeace days and working together as activists and the concerned citizens. She was very much into wanting to get into video production as well. So we teamed up and produced Poisoning Paradise, a native view of the Swan Hills Hazardous Waste Treatment Center, which was a look into, as the title spells out, the Hazardous Waste Treatment Center in northern Alberta, where they would take toxic hazardous waste and burn it, essentially in an incinerator, at the treatment center, which was built on top of a mountain, if you will, at the highest point in Alberta, east of the Rocky Mountains. So by putting an incinerator at its highest point with a smokestack on top of that, what it in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the forest, ensures you get as widespread distribution of contaminants coming out of the smokestack after the fact. Now, they sold this hazardous waste incinerator with the promise that it would burn and destroy 99.99%, which sounds really impressive, but it's 1/10,000th that's still going out. So for every 10,000 tons of material that's being incinerated at that facility, 1 ton is going directly out that smokestack, getting into the air, getting into the environment, into the trees, coming down in the rain, getting into the ground, getting into the wildlife, getting into the water. In this documentary, what we covered were the perspective from the native peoples, we call them indigenous peoples today, the experiences that they were having in the area of the Swan Hills Hazardous Waste Treatment Center, and the differences and the changes that they were seeing in the animals that had worms in their brain, for example, and different what looked like cancers and tumors on organs in their body. So they were very concerned about that, and we produced a documentary. And with that documentary, upon leaving school, it had gotten entered into the Global Visions Film Festival. We got some press in the local papers. I had my face on the front page of View magazine. We were in the Edmonton Journal, the Edmonton Sun. We premiered at the Princess Theatre on White Avenue. So it was quite prestigious. I was feeling pretty good about our documentary. And we used that to launch 2 businesses, the Dragonfly Productions as a production company and Rainbow Bridge Communications Corporation as the distribution arm for the films that we were making and other films that we might take under our wing. So we worked hard on that, getting that film out into a number of different public libraries across Alberta, across Canada, and a number of different educational institutions from high school social studies to right up to university. We were also successful in getting this documentary placed into a number of different film festivals around North America and Europe, Australia even, and broadcast also in Australia, Europe, and Northern Canada. So we were doing pretty good with this student-produced first documentary, and we thought it would be just an easy step from there, distributing that, building on that success, developing more documentaries, and we were off to the races. We were going. The problem with that whole plan is we were starting a business with no money, and it couldn't really last that long without without an income. I was living on peanut butter sandwiches. My new wife at the time, she was covering rent. In fact, we were living in the same complex, Max, here at Strathern at the time. This is so back in 1996. This was putting stress on the relationship, which eventually soured. And I found myself single yet again, needing income, needing opportunity, but still very much committed to our small business, Rainbow Bridge and Dragonfly Productions. I took a volunteer gig with the Dreamspeakers Festival. It was highlighting and showcasing Indigenous, Aboriginal, Native arts in the in television and film. Television and film sectors. I'd volunteered as a camera person for their event here in Edmonton, and through that met Jennifer Bowen, who was down. She was working for the Native Communications Society television department in Yellowknife. So through conversation, she had noted, obviously, I'm a recent graduate of AV Communications. I'm running a camera. I know what I'm doing. They needed some help up there for the summer in their editing and in their television department. So I took a position up there in Yellowknife. It was quite exciting to go up there. And by the end of summer, things worked out so well that they hired me on full time to be their videographer and to work alongside with Jennifer. That fall, we traveled out to Victoria for the North American Indigenous Games. That was quite an exciting, all expense paid trip to go out and cover these games. And throughout that year, we produced a number of shows, the No Name Youth Show, the Denendeh Weekly News, another 1-hour show, which I can't remember what its title was. So we're producing 3 shows to deadline a week. the following year, ended up staying on. Every month, though, I'm sending money back to Edmonton, funneling it back into the business, help subsidize Barb's income, as well as her boyfriend and my friend at the time, Sam. He was helping out with the business, so some money to subsidize their existence and keep the business going. And then I was also pumping money to pay off my student loans, which had grown over a period of 3 years. And then using the rest to keep myself alive up in Yellowknife. We were living fairly cheap. We had a fairly cheap place that Jennifer had rented, a houseboat in Yellowknife Bay. You can still see it painted orange with blue trim. If you see any pictures of Yellowknife Bay and the houseboats, there it is. Max, I've shown you a number of times. Brent Thoma, who I've mentioned on this program, he came up and stayed with us in the houseboat. And my very, very good friend, Colin Saunders, also stayed with us on the houseboat, as well as worked with us at NCS TV. And he worked in the upload. He'll remind me what the name of their department was. They would take the material that we would supply for them on tape, and they would uplink it to satellite for broadcast across all of Northern Canada, Television Northern Canada, at specific times. So it was quite exciting. Sometimes, I'm upstairs in the editing, just trying to very quickly get the last edits, get the credits put on the thing, make my master tape, and then literally, like, we were in the same building, so sometimes I would be running down the stairs at deadline, so maybe like 2 minutes to 5 o'clock or something for the weekly news program, and I got the tape in my hand, and I'd bust through the door, and Colin would be like, "Oh man, like, why?" Because he's got to have something to show, so he's very tense and very nervous that he's not going to have anything to broadcast. And I'll throw a tape in his hand, and normally they would have to, double check, make sure it's queued up and everything is fine, give it a, check all the levels and everything, and adjust for color and audio and whatnot. But sometimes it was such tight timing, I had to assure him, "Colin, don't worry about it. It's all queued up. It's ready to go. It's perfect. Just put it in, hit play, and we're good to go." And most of the time that worked pretty good. It was quite a fun time. We had some good adventures. We covered the Arctic Winter Games that had come to Yellowknife. That was a real blast. Going around and meeting all the different teams and different participants from all over the northern part of the world, whether it be Greenland, Russia, Kamchatka. We have people from Mongolia, of course, Canada, Alaska. It was quite exciting. Were there anybody from? There must have been folks from northern Scandinavia. I don't know. Maybe you guys can remind me, or somebody can do a Google search on that. That would be exciting. So that was fun. My career. My career with Rainbow Bridge and with Dragonfly, that unceremoniously came to an end as well. My business partner didn't feel I was contributing enough to the organization in the fact that I wasn't actually there, even though I was sending quite a lot of the money that I was earning back and funneling it into the organization. That wasn't enough. So they squeezed me out, and now for my second year up in Yellowknife, I was basically on my own. I didn't have a business to support down south. My young marriage was on the rocks. And the good news is I was hired on. Jennifer had left the television department. I think she went off to work for CBC. We were now together as a couple, and I had taken over the position of producer and director and manager of the TV and editor. It was essentially a one-person operation with a couple of volunteers coming in and out. Again, producing 2 or 3 shows a week, primarily from stuff that we'd shot during the summer, but weekly we would produce the news, and that involved me shooting our local newscasters in their different Denendeh languages. So, we had Chippewan, Denendeh, oh my gosh, Dog Rib. I feel so ignorant not remembering all these languages. It was a challenge. I didn't speak any of these languages. I didn't understand them. So I would shoot these languages. It was essentially these newscasters. They primarily worked in radio, but they did our TV news. They would read the English news that was provided for them and make a translation. Now, when it comes to post-production, I've got to edit this language, this person speaking a language that I don't understand. It mostly went off without a hitch, and it was quite fun, and the people of the North very much loved it. We were able to bring them their weekly news and their regional news in their own regional languages. It was quite exciting. Now, since then, Television Northern Canada and NCS TV, I think, all got folded into the APTN, Aboriginal People's Television Network. NCS TV, Native Communications Society, I believe, is still its own standalone organization, although I'm not sure if they're doing television. They had a radio station at the time as well, and I think maybe they still do. CKLB, someone would have to look that up, country music radio station. At any rate, working up there for a couple of years, I was getting a lot of experience and having a lot of fun, and growing as a human being, and really digging working with the Yellowknives Denendeh. We would do some fantastic work where we get flown out to the Barren Lands in autumn, right about this time of year. And if you've ever been to the Barren Lands, oh my gosh, it's not barren at all. Even though there's very, very few trees, and the trees that are there are kind of stunted, maybe 4 feet high, the ground cover are a lot of trees that are actually only this tall. So they would all have leaves that would change color, and it was like Fantasia. It was like being in a cartoon where the colors were so bright and so vivid, yellows and oranges and pinks and purples. The landscape was just amazing, and to be out there with such vast amounts of wilderness, staying in a hunter's cabin, was unbelievable experience. Being with the Yellowknives Denendeh, hunting caribou and on their trips, and doing trips out on the lake. Expeditions. One particularly interesting expedition was to Lutzoke in the east arm of Great Slave Lake for a political meeting, where I think I'm the only white guy, or one of a handful, very few white guys in this community. Traveling upriver, up the Mackenzie River for festivals such as the Woodblock Music Festival in Fort Good Hope, just upriver from Norman Wells, an oil town which had come into existence, the discovery of oil in the Mackenzie River. That oil was used to help drive the American World War II effort. So the oil was discovered World War II or shortly before, pumped out of the river, literally the bottom of the riverbed, and then piped to Alaska, I think, for processing, or somehow the Americans got their hands on all that oil. To go up there, it's quite an impressive sight, because you can see that there are oil drilling platforms right in the middle of the Mackenzie River. It's very wide at that point, and these oil platforms, it's quite the incredible sight to see. Now, old legend has it, the stories that got passed down through the generations of the Denendeh folks up there had told of giant beavers. And you can see outside Norman Wells, there's giant mountains, not giant mountains, but big mountains, that legend says were these giant beavers that had died and turned into this mountain, and the fat from these beavers was what leached out and what became the source of this oil that was eventually discovered in Norman Wells. Now, I don't know, and I don't think there were beavers the size of mountains back then. I guess that would be the equivalent of a dinosaur, even larger than dinosaurs, obviously. But interestingly, at the museum in Yellowknife, I had discovered that there were, way back when, tens of thousands of years ago, giant beavers in the north, that they still had a remembrance of this, and they would pass down these stories. So these beavers, like back then, like they were the size of large bears. Like, can you imagine seeing a beaver that big? At any rate, I'm learning a lot. I'm working with the Yellowknives Denendeh. Although it's not directly with my activism as an environmentalist or social justice activist, I feel like I'm really part of something that's important, working with the Indigenous people up there, providing some assistance to them for them to tell their stories. But obviously it occurs to me, being a white Southerner, I'm not really the best person for that job, even though I was embraced well within the community and given the opportunity to work. I was feeling homesick. It just wasn't fitting in. So I wrapped things up in the north, midsummer 1999, and headed back south to join up with my tribe, what felt like my tribe, the activists and the environmentalists, and what was a growing anti-globalization movement at the time. And you could feel the energy. It's the end of the decade, right? 1999, the end of the millennium. There's a lot of energy. There's a lot of social change happening. Things are moving with the anti-globalization movement, which would culminate and climax almost at the Battle of Seattle, November of 1999. where you saw people from the left and people from the right equally dissatisfied with the governments and with the globalization pattern that was happening, essentially a race to the bottom, where corporations were able to compete with other countries for the lowest possible wages and the lowest possible cost for natural resources. And with these trade agreements that were coming up, whether it be the NAFTA agreement from 1994, North American Free Trade Agreement, or these larger global agreements through the World Trade Organization backed up by the International Monetary Fund, these large agreements would give most of the power to the corporations and very little power to sovereign governments, and almost no power for the people themselves suffering these consequences. So basically a corporation, if it gets a better deal or if it gets weaker regulations in one jurisdiction, it can then sue the other jurisdiction in an effort to bring down the costs and to remove safety regulations and environmental regulations. So basically, for the last 30 years, things have gotten worse instead of improved, even though a lot of us were quite hopeful in the early 1990s that things would steadily improve. So, my apologies to you, dear listener and viewer, and especially Maxwell, that despite all the efforts we put in, the world you're inheriting is not better off. In fact, it's much, much worse off with regards to climate change, with regards to resource depletion, deforestation, desertification, rising sea levels, species extinction, the rise of fascism, population increases, disease, pandemics, all those things. They're all on the rise. And I guess this is what's kind of kept me in the game, even though all these years I've tried to break away from activism a little bit and have a straight job, but I get pulled back in. So it was almost a straight job working in television up north, but I got pulled back in, ended up back down south working in, and jumped right back into activism again, connecting with folks around issues. There was a burgeoning anti-genetically modified organism, anti-GMO movement that was happening, and people would meet at the Strathcona Farmers Market on Saturday with their signs, no GMOs. I dressed up one day, must have been close to Halloween, so I had a Grim Reaper costume, and I put on a sandwich board and said, "God is dead" on one side, and on the back side, "Long live GMOs." Most people didn't even know what GMOs were, so it probably was over their head, but it was an interesting walk from Bonnie Doon down White Ave all the way to Old Strathcona with this Grim Reaper costume on. And some of the other campaigns that I worked on that fall of 1999, I volunteered, if you will. I'd like to say I got hired, but I volunteered for the Alberta Wilderness Association in their efforts to protect a old growth forest area northwest corner of Alberta, Chinchaga Wilderness. Their campaigner, Elena Chiquetto, invited me along. We traveled up there together. We did flyovers of the forest. Got to climb a fire tower, take some video and some photos up there. Met a forest scientist, I believe a biologist, taking us on tours of the forest and showing us the deep mat of moss and old growth life. She could literally just dive her entire arm up to the shoulder in this beautiful earth that had been building up for hundreds and hundreds of years, and these giant trees. It was quite amazing, quite excellent. Shot a lot of video up there for them, and I can't remember exactly what the end result was on the protection of that zone, but I'd like to think we were making some kind of positive impact in raising awareness and providing the campaigners with the visual material they needed to then show with the greater world. So, boy, that was in 1999. Let's see. So I've leveled up. I got my diploma. I got a criminal record for criminal trespass. Oh, what I didn't tell you is that with the sentence I was given, remember I was expecting to get house arrest and instead got probation and a $500 fine and 50 community hours. I was able to check shortly thereafter with the probation officer that allowed me to leave the country on probation. Remember I told you that I took off to Europe shortly thereafter. Upon returning back to Edmonton in the fall, I needed to I needed to complete my community hours, and what I was able to do is volunteer with a local organization. Basically, I convinced them that I would do research in their library for these 50 community hours and turn it into a project, and I think it ended up being the beginnings of the documentary that I produced in a couple of years, the Poisoning Paradise documentary. So it was quite good. I got to do my community hours. I gave some good work to a local organization working on these issues, and again was able to double up on that work and use the research as the basis for my final video documentary in 1996. So I'm about halfway through my activist career at this point, maybe not even close. I'm about 5 years away from having my life threatened and being pushed up against the wall by an ex-cop. That was kind of an interesting scene. It wasn't the first time my life was threatened, actually. It had been threatened at the camp in Clayoquot Sound the summer that I was on trial. Made another visit up there and was providing security for the camp one night when a bunch of folks, locals, and I assume forest workers happened upon the camp, and they were all parked out on the highway, and we went out to greet them and just kind of be a block for them and the folks that were intense. And they were very rude, very aggressive. Like I said, I got threatened personally, and they had also threatened to come back in the middle of the night and burn down the tents and do unspeakable things to the women that were in the camp. Thankfully, that didn't happen. The police weren't a lot of help in dissuading these folks from their behavior, but I guess they did hold them back far enough that we didn't have to suffer assault. So that's it. That wraps up episode 3, Leveling Up, on my true crime stories on Confessions of a Gen X Activist. True crime stories. I hope you get an opportunity to keep tuning in, keep hearing these stories, especially Max. Like I mentioned, this is primarily spurred on and motivated by you suggesting that I produce a podcast based on some of the stories that I was telling you. If you don't know me, and you're here and you're listening to this, then wow, I'm kind of amazed and freaked out about that. I hope that you've given an opportunity to like the video and maybe subscribe and help boost this channel up. So one day when I expand past these podcasts, we will have an audience, a larger audience to distribute to. With that being said, adieu.